Start this. Okay. So, goal today and over the next several classes that we have together will be to review, look over the assignment, and we'll just cover sort of the basics, review a little bit from each assignment, sort of, and use an example passage from Proverbs, because our focus will be primarily on the Proverbs assignments, but I'll also that's a little bit the Psalms assignment. That's the same step. Just for some of you, you still aren't needing to work on those. So that's the plan. And then when we go through it, if you have any questions at all, I just want to make sure that everybody understands what's being required for each assignment. So if you have a question, please make sure to ask. And after we go through it, if some of you have already turned in that assignment, want to redo it, you're perfectly welcome to do that as well. But if you haven't turned the assignment in, hopefully after we go through it, I would take the opportunity then and just do it for your passage when it's fresh in your mind. So that would be my recommendation to you. And again, continue just working on those of you who still have module 1 or module 2 assignments. Continue just trying to do one of those each week so that we can be so you can be caught up, as we discussed in our last class, the sort of the schedule and the plan. I secured my airline tickets for June, so I have planned to be there by, I think it's on Saturday, June, what is it, 18? Check the calendar here. Yeah, I plan to be there at CDO on the 18th and then leaving on the 25th. Both of those are Saturdays. So I did get my tickets to come. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the 2 assignments I want to focus on are specifically assignment 315 and 3:7, and this has to do with the setting and the structure of the poem. Okay, structure of the poem. Because if you remember, and go back to our process here, we have the first 3 steps, which you would do this. You don't need to do these for Psalms, but you do for Proverbs. And we talked about that last week. We went over the first assignment for your Proverbs passage is to do the background and literary context of the book. But for your Psalms passage, you don't have to worry about that because each Psalm is independent of the other Psalms. And so there's no need to study the book of Psalms as a whole. But for Proverbs, you do need to do that because your Proverbs passage is part of a book which has a purpose. It has author, recipients, an overall theme and structure, whereas the Psalms has several authors, several different purposes, depending on the poem. Each poem is independent, it has its own context. And so that is actually, as we look at the step of poetic analysis, the very first part of that in analyzing a poem is to, well, here's the steps for poetic analysis. First, it's to read and observe the poem. Okay. And then secondly, and this is where we'll focus our time today, identify the setting and structure of the poem. And then the next step is do the parallelism analysis, which Lord willing, we'll look at that next week. And then these imagery and a poetic devices. So hopefully this is, this will stir up your memories of each of those things that we did together in the past as we were going through this module. But here, what I want to do is take advantage the next several weeks and sort of review these steps and then go over the assignments with you just to make sure everybody is clear. Okay. Now, as you think about, as we approach studying the poem itself, Again, whether it's a psalm or whether it's your specific Proverbs passage, these are the steps you're going to take as you examine the poem. Obviously, the first one, as is the case all the time, is to read and observe. So reading the poem several times. And since your poems are very short, right, they're only 6 or 7 verses, 5 or 6 or 7 verses, then you should be able to read through it a number of times. And as I have recommended, read through it in different translations. Read through it in one translation first, many times to get familiar with it. And then read through it in some other translations. And I think any differences will stick out to you. And those might be things to pay attention to. Now, after you do these several readings, then go through and make observations of the poem. Okay. Again, looking for details, things repeated, the tone of the poem, what the author's situation might be, any questions you have from the poem, just things that you notice. Maybe you see something in the poem that reminds you of another passage. Just all those kinds of things you're going to make observations for. So that's the first step in poetic analysis. Again, step 4 here in poetic analysis is the first thing we want to do is read and observe the poem. Okay. And then following that, we want to identify the structure, the setting and structure of the poem. That's let me cut and paste these here. That is the second step in poetic analysis, where we actually begin to examine the poem after we've read through it and examined it more carefully. Then we want to go back and essentially identify the setting and the structure. Now, what do I mean by that? And if you remember, the setting and the structure of the poem, the setting is its background, the situation of the poem, when it was written, who wrote it, to whom did he write it, any places mentioned or any people mentioned, all of that kind of information. All right. And then that's the setting. Then we want to take a look at the structure of the poem. That is, can you identify each of its stanzas? Okay, so that's the focus in this second step as we examine do the poetic analysis for each of these for your poem. All right. So with that, let me see, did I have anything else? So yeah, for the structure of the poem, again, the background context, as I mentioned, these are some of the questions you'll be trying to answer as you look at the poem. Again, who wrote it, places mentioned, people mentioned, all these things which we looked at in the epistles. Okay, you're looking for the same type of information. It's just going to be a little bit easier because you're dealing with a smaller poem, at least in the case of the Psalms. In the case of Proverbs, your passage will be part of the larger book. And so some of this information actually will be, most of it covered already in the background context of the book. And I'll talk about that when we actually look at the assignment. Okay, so with that, let me just make sure. So that's just a quick overview. Are there any questions on that before we look at the assignments in particular? Okay, hopefully that's just review and things will come to your mind. And as I do the assignment then as well, hopefully that will stir your thought. Let me start with the Psalms assignment. Okay, this is the actual assignment. This is just what I have posted on Canvas, all right, which gives the example of the assignment. So it's basically 3 parts. You have the instructions for the assignment at the beginning. So I just tell you what it is you need to do for this assignment. So for assignment 3.7, it is basically these first few steps in poetic analysis. Read and observe the poem, all right? And notice I said make at least 15 observations, okay? So just read through the poem several times, then read through the poem in other translations several times, and just make 15 observations, whatever you want to note from your readings. And then the next step would be identify the setting. Again, that is the background context of the poem. All right. See if you can identify what prompted the author to write the poem and even what its purpose is, and along with the author, recipients, and all of those things that are given here in the step. And then after that, in the third step, identify what kind of a poem is it. All right. Remember, there's wisdom poetry, there's psalms of praise, hymns of praise, there's thanksgiving psalms, there's enthronement, laments, precatory. There's the different categories that we covered in the let's see, what session was that? Back in, I want to say sessions 10 or 11, somewhere in there. Okay. So those are the three parts for this assignment. And then I give you an example just to show you. We went through this example in the class. All right. I'm not going to go through it now, but you can look at it yourself, and just gives an example of the information that I'm asking you to put down. Note how many times you read through the poem and what translations you read, and then make at least 15 observations. Let's see, did I make 15 here? 3, 6, 9. Okay, I made more than 15. All right, notice some of the observations are questions. Some are like sort of hypotheses that I have. And then I mentioned the translations. Any differences there that I saw? Repeated words. Okay, those are the kind of things you're going to look for. All right, so that's under the read and observe. That should probably take you, I would say, less than an hour. And if you have a very short poem, it will be even less than that. If you have only 4 or 5 verses, it won't take you long at all, really, to do this step. Okay? That's the first step, read and observe. And then the second one is to identify the setting. That, again, is the background context of the poem. Now, for the Psalms, if you remember, sometimes that background information, some of it is found in the title. If you have a title to your Psalm, then you will have some help there, perhaps. You might be told the author, you might be told something of the background of the particular Psalm. In the case of Psalm 128, it says it's a song of ascents. So that tells us a little bit actually about the purpose of the Psalm, that it was intended to be sung during the pilgrimages of the 3 feasts, where everyone will gather to Israel. All right. So sometimes, more than half the time in the Psalms, the author is going to be indicated. All right. I think it's 116 of the Psalms, if I remember correctly, have the author. All right. So most of the Psalms state the author. The recipients typically is Israel, or it could be the Lord if it's a prayer or a psalm of thanksgiving. But ultimately, the audience is intended to be the people of Israel. Sometimes, or many times, these psalms are songs that are meant to be sung. Other times, they are just meant to give instruction. So when you're doing this setting, you're looking for author, recipients. When was it written? Well, if you know who the author is, that gives you a good idea of when it was written. If it's David, then you know within, what is it, from 1010 BC until 970, I think, or something like that. If it's Solomon, then it would be from 970 BC and then after that. If it's the sons of Korah, then that's a little bit broader period. But if you know who the author is, you'll know about when it's written. Most of the Psalms are written around the time of David or Solomon. Okay? Majority of the Psalms are. There are a few, like Psalm 90, who was written by Moses. So that was written very early, or Psalm 126 or 134, I think it is, which were written after the exile. Or during the exile. But most of the Psalms actually were written around the time of David or Solomon in there. Geography, sometimes there'll be places mentioned in the Psalm. You just want to note that in this step and identify where that place is. Social context, are there any names mentioned in the psalm? Either specific names or perhaps a group of people, like in Psalm 128, wife and children are mentioned. No specific names, but just the general category. So you just want to note that. Culturally, what do you find in the poem there that could be connected to the culture? Does it talk about slavery or some particular customary practice or something like that? And then finally, the occasion for the psalm, that is what prompted it and what is its purpose, okay? So this is just all background information. Again, just like we did for the epistles, it's the similar kinds of things we're looking for, except in this case, it is a psalm. Now, in some psalms, if you know who the author is, or you know the background situation, you may have some more information about that given elsewhere in Scripture. So for example, if you're studying Psalm 51, it says in the title that this was a psalm written after Nathan had rebuked David for what he had done with Bathsheba. So there you're told specifically when that psalm, the background of that psalm. So you can go back to 2 Samuel 11 and 12 and get all the information about that psalm. Or I think Psalm 52 or 3, it says it was written at the time of Doeg the Edomite, when he told Saul about the priests that had helped David. So you can go back to 1 Samuel, and find that the history to that, okay? So sometimes the psalm will give you enough information, you can actually go to another passage in Scripture and get more of background. Okay, other times you won't have that necessarily, but every psalm, there will be something in the psalm, either in the title and also in the psalm itself, that will give a clue about the situation. Maybe perhaps who the author is or what circumstance the author is in. You may have a lament psalm that doesn't have the name of the author, but you know he's in a situation where he's struggling, he's discouraged, he's crying out for help. So you can at least make comment on his situation. So the setting of the poem is that background, all right? Any questions on that?
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I try to go back to the 15 observations, sir.
Yes.
I want to clarify.
Okay.
From the literary context, sir, Proverbs chapter 3, it is an observation. I noticed that the author says that if you love wisdom, it prolong your life. That's considered observation from the text, sir.
Yeah, you mean from...
I want to clarify if it is an observation. Yeah. It seems like an interpretation.
Yeah, you can have observations that are interpretive, but I would just put something like, it seems like the author is saying this, or from these words, it sounds like the author means this. So you can't be conclusive yet, right? You're just making an observation. An observation is not a conclusion. An observation is just noticing something. Okay, so, but you can certainly remark on that this verse and this psalm sounds like he's saying there's blessing for having wisdom. So you can make that observation. I would probably try to look for things that stick out to you like that. Maybe he repeats that idea a few times, or maybe that verse reminds you of another passage that says that, or maybe there's a question that you have from that. But certainly it's okay to have, I call them hypotheses at this stage, where you can make an assertion or a claim about the meaning of a verse, but right now it's just a claim. It's not, you haven't done the study to confirm it, right? at this point, at the beginning. So I just put down the observation, but just remember, it's not really a conclusion yet, but you can state that, I think the poet is saying this, or it sounds like the poet means this. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, sir. Because usually, from my observation, more on imperative in chapter 3 of Psalms, like, for example, trust in the Lord with all your heart. That's the reason that I take note that the result of trusting God, He will direct your path.
Yeah.
It seems like interpretative.
Yeah, it is, but it's okay when you're making the observation. You can just say it like this. What verse is that?
Verse 5, sir. That's why I am confused from my observation. Verse 5 to 6.
Sure. So, in all your ways acknowledge him, he will make your path straight. So yeah, I might say, this is how I would write the observation. I'd put verse 6, and then I'd say
verse 5 and 6, sir.
Yeah, 5 and 6, and then I would just say the last line of verse 6 sounds like the result of following verse 5 and verse 6a. Or you could just say it. If we trust in the Lord and acknowledge him, then verse 6 says that he will make our paths straight. You can make that as an observation. All right. It is interpretive, but that's okay. You're not going to preach right after you make observations, right? You're going to do more study to confirm if your statement is correct, if your interpretation is accurate, right?
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, some of your observations will be interpretive like that. All right. Again, in verse 8, right? Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body, refreshment to your bones. Well, verse 8 sounds like a result of verse 7, doesn't it? So you can make that observation. That's perfectly fine. But just know that at this stage, you're right at the beginning of your study. So you can't be certain of that conclusion, but you can certainly present as an observation what you see there. Okay? That's going to be something later as you study the passage in more detail that you will be able to confirm if your interpretation was correct. Okay, so yes, some observations, many of your observations are going to be some interpretation. That's just, it will be hard not to. It's just you cannot, at this stage, it's not a strong conclusion yet, right? It is you're just observing it, you're noticing it, and that's fine. Even if it's interpretive, that's okay. But not all your observations should be that. I mean, you need to be asking questions. You need to be noticing things that are repeated. You need to be identifying things that don't make sense as well. Okay, you're not just going through and summarizing your interpretation of each verse. That's not observation. Okay, sometimes you can do that, but you need to have other kinds of observations as well. You can look at my example and see. So let's do that real quick. All right. So if we go back, this is whoops. Where is it? Ah, here. Okay. So here are my observations from Psalm 128. Okay. So look at the first one. The psalm begins with a declaration of blessing. In fact, the whole psalm has a tone of instruction and inspiration. That's really interpretive, isn't it? But that's just my observation, what I see at the beginning. The next observation, blessed is repeated. Okay, now I don't give the meaning of blessed here. I just say I notice that he repeats the word blessed. Then I noticed he uses other words that are similar to bless, at least in English, the English interpretation. I noticed who fears the Lord is repeated. And then here's an interpretive statement. I say that the condition of blessing is everyone who fears the Lord. Well, that's an interpretation, but again, I can say that at this stage. I'm not going to preach this passage tomorrow, all right? I'm just looking for things that I notice. I noticed the focus in the passage seemed to be on the family, and that the poem was directed to men. And I notice for each of these, by the way, I'm putting verse numbers. Do you guys see that? That's where I'm seeing the observation. So make sure you put that in. But then I get to here and notice I have a question. Is Jerusalem mentioned because the poem is a song of ascent? Or I have another question. Why did he say behold in verse 4? Or what is meant by the similes in verse 3? Okay, so these are questions that I have that I'm not sure about. How do verses 5 and 6 connect to verses 1 and 4? It seems to be a prayer. Okay, so here I give a hypothesis, or I try to answer my question, just an idea. Okay? And then at the bottom here, all the translations are similar, and I just noticed one difference was in verse 2. Okay, those are some examples of observation. Some of them are interpretive. Some of them are questions. Some of them are just noticing what is apparent there, repeated words or things like that. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right. That's a good question. It's an important one. So don't be afraid to, if you see something and you make an interpretive conclusion, that's okay. But just remember that you may or may not be right. All right. It's just something you're noticing at the beginning, but you want to have a variety of observations, not just one kind of observation. Okay. That's just, again, the whole point of this step is just getting familiar with the poem. Just to get familiar with it. Think about it. Look at it from different perspectives. Consider, that's why you look at different translations. Maybe something comes out in one translation that doesn't in another. But the whole point of this step is just trying to get familiar with the poem so that it will prepare you for the next steps of study. Okay? And I think, as I mentioned to you, a lot of times if the poem is short enough, I try to memorize it, actually, as well. So during the week I'm studying it, I'm actually trying to memorize it to just have it so that I could think about it and consider it, meditate on it. Any other questions about the reading and observing? So when I look at your assignment, I don't go and say, and look at your statement and say, oh no, that's a wrong interpretation. I'm not looking for that. I'm just seeing if you are interacting with the poem, if you're observing different kinds of things, if you're asking questions. I'm not evaluating if your observations are accurate or not, just that you're making them. You're trying to ask questions and think about your passage. That's all I'm looking for, okay? And I'm not looking for like a summary. Don't summarize each verse. That's not making observations. That's just summarizing it. We'll be doing that in later steps. Try to do more of just looking for specific details that stick out to you. And then once you've done that, next is looking at the setting as we discussed. Are there any questions about setting? Again, I give you the specific things you're looking for in the setting. Okay. And then, so any questions on that setting? Like I said, I really like studying the Psalms because often it's all self-contained in the poem. You don't have to have read the entire book because each poem has its own setting. to it. Now, again, sometimes that setting, you can connect it to another passage in scripture, because you find out that when the poem was written, may have a connection to a particular text outside of the Psalms. But for the most part, all of these Psalms are self-contained. So that makes it easier to study the background. The third step in this assignment, and the third and last step in this assignment, is to identify the type of poem and its structure. Okay, so when we're looking at the type of poem, we want to remember that the type of poem, again, I mentioned, if you go back to, I think it's session 310 or 311, something like that. I go through all the different kinds of types of poems. Remember, we had the praise, lament, imprecatory, songs of ascent, wisdom, enthronement. These are all the different types of poems that we have in the Psalms. Actually, one guy went and made 26 categories of psalm types, which I think is too many. Because really you can summarize them into just, what is there here? 3, 4, 5, 9. There's 9 types here. So, 8 or 9 is probably enough categories. So you just want to identify the type of the psalm you have. Is it a praise psalm? Is it a wisdom psalm? Now, if you're studying the Proverbs, it's going to be a wisdom poem, right? The whole book is wisdom literature. So that's easy. When your Proverbs passage, you know already what kind of poem is it? It's a wisdom poem. All right. Now, there are some Psalms that are wisdom poems as well. Psalm 73, Psalm 1, Psalm 127. I would say maybe even Psalm 128. Those are all poems intended to give instruction. All right. They're not necessarily praise or laments or song of ascents. They're a poem written to give instruction, like a wisdom poem in Proverbs. All right. Psalm 78 is a wisdom poem. All right. Or you have many praise psalms and you have many psalms of lament as well. But just indicate the type of poem that you have, that you're working with. That's all. You don't have to do a lot of detail. Just say, oh, this is a psalm of praise, or this is a psalm of lament. And then the big one is to identify the structure of the poem. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, just like an epistle, if you remember, in an epistle, you have a flow of thought, right? You have paragraphs, and each paragraph represents a unit of thought, a singular point. And the author of the epistle, he's putting each paragraph one after the other, and they're all connected. They're all independent points, but they all are connected to each other. They form a flow of thought. And it's the same in poetry. Each poem has a unit of thought called a stanza. All right, it's the same idea as a paragraph in an epistle, in that it is a group of phrases and clauses, sentences combined together that communicate a point. That is a stanza. And that stanza in a poem, you may have 2, 3, 4, 5 stanzas that all each of those stanzas are connected to each other, and then all together they teach the point of the psalm, the main idea of the psalm. And so at this step, what we're trying to do is identify those stanzas, get an idea of the structure. Now, later on, we may learn more about the poem and change the outline or the structure as we learn more. But I want you at this stage just to be trying to look for those, just like we did with the epistles, where we tried to identify each paragraph and then summarized each paragraph to get an idea of the author's flow of thought. We're doing the same thing here with these poems. But again, it's a little easier because most of the poems are shorter than an epistle. Okay? So with that, what does that look like? How do we do that? How do we identify the structure? Again, if you'll remember, the Bible translations offer their interpretation of the structure. Okay, so each psalm, if you look at the translation, there usually will be a space between each stanza. So for example, we go back to, say, Psalm 128. Notice the New American Standard has a space here between verse 4 and verse 5. So it identifies two stanzas, verses 1 to 4, and then verses 5 and 6. We go to Psalm 127. Notice there's a space between verse 2 and verse 3. So the New American Standard has it verses 1 and 2, and then verses 3 and 5. Okay, so that's a good starting point. Take your translation, and how does it divide it up? The ESV, let's look at what they have. They have the same thing for Psalm 127, verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 and 2 are one stanza, and then verses 3 to 5. So they agree with the New American Standard on that psalm. Psalm 128, they actually have a little bit of a difference. Remember, New American Standard had two stanzas, verses 1 to 4, verses 5 to 6. But the ESV has three stanzas, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and then 5 to 6. Okay, so how do we know which one is more likely to be correct? Well, we can always look at another translation and just see. This one has three stanzas, but it's verse 1, then verses 2 to 4, then 5 and 6. The NIV has two stanzas like the New American Standard, verses 1 to 4. So we see two of the translations agree, the other two do not. So how do we know what is the correct one? Well, we have a strong case that since two of these translations agree, that's a good starting point. And then what we want to do is look for other features, look for other factors. So for example, we checked the translations, so we did that. And I noted that the New American Standard, the Legacy Standard, and the NIV all had the same two stanzas identified. Okay, so that's a good start. Then what you want to look for, actually, let me go to the notes here, is you look for structural markers. Okay, there are other things in the poem that can indicate the structure. Sometimes it's a refrain. Again, remember that's a repeated verse or sentence, like a chorus in a song that you see repeated more than once. Or sometimes the difference in stanzas can be seen by a change in the speaker. You may have the psalmist speaking, and then maybe in the other stanza, it's the Lord speaking. Or perhaps a change in pronouns. Sometimes in the psalm, you may see he for a few verses, and then it's I. That may indicate a change in stanzas or a change in subject matter or theme. You may see a particular focus in these few verses, and then the other verses has another focus to it. Anything else on here? Change in tone. Again, like in a lament. A lament, you may have the first few verses is a cry for help, a cry for discouragement, and then there may be a few verses in the psalm that are a statement of that aren't a cry for or a prayer. They're a statement of what the psalmist is going to do or think. Okay. There may be an inclusio. Again, that's where a first line matches a line later in the poem, and it's not a refrain. It's actually intended to be bookends. There's a few psalms like that. Sometimes that instructional Selah can be a marker. Not all the time, but sometimes. Do I have anything else? Inclusio, I mentioned that. Change in grammar. You may have a particular psalm that has uses imperatives in some verses, and then in other verses it uses verbs that are indicative or interrogative. Okay, so looking for that. Exclamations sometimes can divide stanzas, where the stanza begins with an exclamation, "Oh Lord," or "Oh my soul," or something like that, or "Behold." So these are all, they're different markers to look for in looking for stanzas. So in the assignment, I show in the example here that in Psalm 128, there was an inclusio, where verse 1 and verse 4, the beginning of verse 1, the end of verse 4, were a very similar statement. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord. He says that in verse 1, and then he repeats that idea in verse 4. Also, in Psalm 128, there was a shift in tone. Verses 1 to 4 was a direct statement, but verses 5 and 6 were a form of prayer. There was also a change in focus. The first 4 verses was on the man himself and his family, and the last 2 verses was on Jerusalem and Israel. So I just look for other clues that indicated the stanzas. Look for those markers. And again, you can look on session 3.12, I think, 3.13, 3.12. We'll have that information in detail. Okay. But what we're trying to do at this stage in this third step is figure out initially what is the structure of the poem. That is, what are the stanzas in the poem? Okay. All right, I'm going to go through the assignment, the example from Proverbs for this in a little more detail for that assignment. All right, so we'll go back through these steps, but we'll look at it for the passage in Proverbs, and we'll go through that together. Okay, unless there are any questions or comments that you guys have right now. Anybody? What I showed you was assignment 3.7, which is the setting and structure for your Psalms passage. Okay. Now, for your Proverbs passage, that's assignment 3.15, which I show here, 3.15. And there are a few slight differences than from your Psalms assignment 3.7. Okay. The steps are the same. Read and observe. Okay. Read through the poem. Now, in this case, you have a passage that is assigned to you from one of the wisdom poems in the first 9 chapters. Okay, I didn't give you the entire wisdom poem. I didn't say do all of Proverbs 2, but I do give you like 7 or 8 or 9 verses from that psalm. But what I want you to do is you're going to read through the whole chapter that your passage is in. Okay, so for example, in the example we're going to do here, it's from Proverbs 1. I've highlighted in blue. That's the passage we're going to look at and go through together just to do this example. But notice it's part of the whole poem from Proverbs chapter 1. Okay. Really, it's Proverbs 1, 8 through 33. That's the first wisdom poem in Proverbs, because remember, verses 1 to 7, that was the introduction. Okay, so that's not part of the wisdom poem. That's the introduction to the book. But beginning in verse 8 is the first wisdom poem in Proverbs, and it goes from verse 8 through verse 33. Okay, so this is the entire first poem in Proverbs. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to use verses 10 through 19 as sort of the example to do this assignment. All right. You have a different passage. You'll have, each of you will have a passage either from chapter 2 or 3 or 4 or 6, I think. But it won't be the whole chapter. It'll just be one section of it. All right. But in the first step for your Proverbs passage, don't just read your passage, read the whole chapter. Okay. So if your passage is Proverbs 2, 1 to 6, read all of chapter 2, because that's the whole poem. You don't have to preach on the whole poem, but you need to understand the whole poem. Okay. That means you need to, for read and observe, read through the whole chapter several times. Okay. You don't have to read through the whole book or through chapters 1 to 9. You've already done that for your assignment 3.14, the background and context of the whole of the book of Proverbs. For this assignment, you're just focused on your poem, your passage, and the chapter in which it is contained. Okay, does that make sense? So if you're assigned Proverbs 2, 1 to 8, I think is one of them, or 1 to 6, I can't remember. Maybe it's 1 to 8. That is the passage you will preach, verses 1 to 8. But for your reading and observations, you're going to read all of chapter 2. Okay? Or maybe I gave you chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Same thing. That will be the passage you preach, but for your reading and observation, you need to do the whole, all of chapter 3, because that's the whole poem. Okay? Or I may have given you a passage from Psalm 119. Now in that case, the poem's pretty large, all right? So you can just focus on your stanza there, but you do need to read the poem at least a few times for Psalm 1. That's for the Psalms. But for Proverbs, I want you to read the whole chapter and make observation, not just your 6 or 7 verses. All right? Okay. And then once you've done that, then we'll identify the setting. But first, let's go ahead and just do the example together. I'm going to have you guys read this. We're going to do the Proverbs 1 passage for our example. So Brother Arn, I'm going to ask if you could read verses 8 to 19. Noor, if you could read verses 20 to 27, and then Sid, if you could read 28 to 33. All right.
Okay, I'm going to read verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. True, in your lot with us, we shall all have one purse. Until
verse 19.
Verse 15, my son, do not walk in the way of the damned. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil, and the hasten to shed blood. And indeed, it is useless to spread
Certain place enlarge the
the
font.
dead and sight of any bird, but lie in wait for their own blood, the ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors.
Is that big enough?
90. Yes, yeah. Thank you, Pastor Tim. Okay. 20. Wisdom shouts in the streets. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delights themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I called, and you refused. I stretched out my hand, and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes, when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. When disasters and anguish come upon you.
Verse 28 to 33. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat of the fruit of their own way and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of the fools will destroy them. But he who listens to me shall live securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil.
All right. Thank you. Now that's the whole poem. All right. Verses 8 to 33 that you guys read. So I'm just going to focus. The passage that I have is verses 10 to 19. So it's just a part of that poem. But like I said, for the assignment, you will just have a part of the whole poem, but I want you to read the whole wisdom poem several times. So that's what I did for this section. We just read it once. I read it a number of times. I have 14, I think. So in your assignment, you will just note how many times did you read through the chapter. Again, notice the chapter of my assigned Proverbs passage. And then make general observations. All right. Again, notice I have questions in here. I have things that I see repeated in here. Here, I'll expand this a little bit for you. I have just general observations. Verse 1 indicates the author. Verse 8, Solomon directly addresses his son. He says, my son. And then verse 8, I asked the question, is son a reference to a single son, or is he speaking to all of his children? That was just a question I had. Repetition, son's repeated 3 times. So these are just observations that I make of the whole chapter. not just my verses. Okay? Because again, you need to get familiar with the whole wisdom poem. You won't be preaching the whole wisdom poem. You'll be preaching just a part of it, but you need to understand the whole poem and how your section fits into it. Okay? So that is the, again, just like with the Psalms passage in the assignment 3.7, in this assignment, you're doing the same thing. You're reading through the whole poem several times and then making some observations. Okay? And then notice some of my observations are outside of the poem because, like, for example, I had a passage about Solomon and his Proverbs writing from 1 Kings. So like I said, sometimes you may have an observation where you say, hey, I think I remember this statement was made in another passage, and then you can put that down as an observation. That's perfectly fine. Okay? So that makes sense, you guys? You're going to have a few verses taken out of an entire wisdom poem. So just read the whole poem, read the whole chapter, and make observations. Now, then when you do the setting, it's the same thing. All right, you're going to read the whole chapter. Now, for Proverbs, this is kind of easy. You've already done most of the setting because you looked at the setting of the book, right? So really, most of your answers for the background of your poem, you've already gotten when you did the background for the book. You know who the author is. You know who the recipients are. You know the reason that he wrote the book. You know when. Now, the only thing that may be different is you may have more information on the geography and the people. Okay? Because your chapter may have other places that are mentioned that it will have specific places that are mentioned. So for example, so in my case, these first four, the author, recipients, when it was written, that's all. I just take my answers from the background context of Proverbs. So that's easy. I'm just copying. I'm copying myself, all right, from what I did in the first assignment, assignment 3.14. So I'm just putting that here. But then I notice in chapter 1, there's a few places mentioned. Now, these are places from the whole book, but then notice Sheol is mentioned in verse 12, right? Let us swallow them alive like Sheol. That's a place. Okay. We could say the street is a place too. It's not a specific street, but it's just a general statement about the street. Could have put that one in as well. But here in this part, the geographical context, they're simply noting what places are mentioned in this chapter. What do we know about them? And then what people are mentioned in your chapter. In my case, the naive and the fool were mentioned, as well as Solomon's son, which I should have put in there as well. Okay. And again, the occasion is from the book. All right. So for the setting of this poem, much of the information you already have because it's one of the poems in the book. And we already did the assignment. Well, the assignment before this is looking at the setting or background context of the whole book. All right. Now, in the Psalms, this was a little different. In the Psalms, each psalm is independent. So each psalm has its own setting. Okay. In Proverbs, it's a book. So every poem essentially has the same setting or much of the setting is similar. The same author, same recipients, same purpose. Where you may have some differences is each chapter may mention different places or different people. Okay. Questions on that? Does that make sense? So for this part of the assignment, you'll be going, praise God, I've already done most of this, all right, for step 2. All right, so if you've done the assignment before that, all right, you're going to be just taking much of that information. And then, like I said, the geography and the social people mentioned, you'll have some details in that chapter that you want to call out. Okay. Noor, you have a question?
I have observation.
Yes.
When he said my son, he was writing to all, especially everyone.
Oh, you mean is he calling everybody reading this his son? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and it is just an kind. I do not know how to put it in words.
Yeah, I
Writing
would.
to all, especially everyone.
Yeah, you could put that in the form of, I would put it in the form of a question, is that when Solomon says my son, is he only thinking of his sons or is he thinking of a broader audience? Okay. So you can put it in the form of a question. We don't know for sure right now. It would seem like he's talking about his children because he said your father's instruction and your mother's teaching, but at the observation stage, we could ask it in the form of a question. Okay. Or we could say, perhaps when he says my son, he's referring generally to all of his readers. But I would put it in the form of a question. In fact, I think I did have a question in my observations regarding that, where I said, is son a reference to a single son or all his children? And then you could add to that, or all his readers. Okay.
Thank you.
That's a good question, observation. Again, it's just, you're thinking about what he's saying. And that's what we're trying to accomplish at this step, is just to be thinking about what he has said. And then the setting, as I said, is just going to be, what is the background of that poem? And much of it will be the same background as for the whole book. Okay, good. Any other questions or comments or observations? All right. And then we have the third step for this, which again, same as we did in the Psalms assignment. What type of poem is it? Well, that's easy, right? It's a wisdom psalm. Praise God. Hallelujah, right? We don't have to guess on this one. I give you the answer. Your poem is a wisdom psalm. There, you have the answer. So you can send me some pesos later. But like I said, given the genre of the book of Proverbs, every poem within the book can be classified as a wisdom poem. And then I mentioned there are a number of psalms that are also wisdom psalms. But so the type of poem in the your Proverbs passage, it's going to be wisdom. Now the challenging part is, okay, how do I identify the structure? How do I identify the stanzas within my Proverbs passage? All right, well, again, I start with the translations. And notice, in this case, with the translations, here, give me 1 second. Okay, with the translation here, there are 4 translations that I checked that had the same stanzas. All right. And actually, another translation, the NIV, was very close. Up to verse 19, it was the same. And then there was a little bit of a difference in the last. Okay, so that's actually a good sign that if you have 4 translations that agree, or almost 5, then that's probably what the stanzas are, okay? But still, you want to look for structural markers that may confirm that. So here, let me do this. Let's view split. Okay, so what I want to do here then is, okay, I'm going to look for structural markers. That is, do I see any refrain, inclusio, a salah, perhaps some exclamation? And notice what I noticed is in verse 8, he has, "Hear my son." Verse 10, he says, "My son." Verse 15, he says, "My son." That seems to indicate perhaps those are the beginning of each of those stanzas. Okay. He doesn't do that in the rest of the poem, but at least in the beginning part he does. And he seems to say something a little different with that. "My son," and then he talks about basically a call to listen. And then in verse 10, he says, "My son, if sinners entice you," and then what they might say to him. And then in verse 15, he talks about, "My son, don't follow them." So basically verse 10, "My son, don't listen to them." Verse 15, "My son, don't follow them." Okay, that's sort of what seemed to stick out to me. Then I said, okay, how about, is there a change in the speaker or the tone or the grammar? And then I thought verse 20, there was a change in speaker. Notice it moves from Solomon talking to his son, "Hear my son, my son, my son." And then notice verse 20, it shifts to, "Wisdom shouts in the streets." And this is what she says, the rest of these verses. Okay, so that's a shift, right? It's now it's moved from Solomon speaking to his sons to now he's writing about wisdom crying out in the streets. And then verse 28, there's a change in person from direct address to the third person. "They will call on me, but I will not. They will seek me, but they will not find me." Okay. So using all of that information, I put together what I thought was the most likely structure that I could see at this point in my study. All right. I said the New King James follows many of these markers and serves as a good starting point. And then I mentioned the only change I see is to divide verses, some of the verses, because of the reference to "my son." So I came up with this outline based upon, one, the translations. They formed a guide for me. And then I looked for these structural markers for clues that might indicate a stanza, either a shift in speaker, a shift in tone, an exclamation, apostrophe that was noted in verses 8, 10, and 15. So this is the proposed structure that I have for, and notice I do it for the whole chapter. Again, do this for the whole chapter. This assignment is to do all of the chapter, what your passage is in. Okay, so the reading and observations, the setting and the structure are all intended. You do the assignment for the whole chapter. Now, when you preach your passage, you only preach the passage. You don't have to preach the whole chapter. But for this part of your study, this assignment, I want you to do the whole chapter. Okay? Any questions about the structure? This third step, this third part. Anybody? Hopefully that's clear. All right. Again, same 3 steps for both of these assignments. Read and observe the whole chapter. Oops. Identify the setting for the whole chapter. And again, most of that you already have from your first assignment. Identify the type and structure of the whole chapter. All right. So in assignment 3.7, which is for your Psalm passage, okay, it's the same 3 steps for the whole Psalm. And by the way, you preaching the whole psalm. For the Proverbs passage that you have, I only gave you part of the whole wisdom poem. But I want you to do these 3 steps for the whole poem. Just like for the whole psalm, do these 3 steps for the whole poem. All right? For this assignment. Okay? And then I give you space to do the assignment for your passage. Okay? And it's just, I already laid out I even put the things for the structure. So hopefully that'll make it a little easier for you. I hope, okay? All right. And that's it. That's those 2 assignments. So that's the setting and structure assignment for your Psalms passage, and then for your Proverbs passage. Okay. And by the way, if you do, make sure when you do these assignments, do them separately. I don't want you to combine, do your Psalms passage and your Proverbs passage together. They're 2 separate assignments. All right. So just do them. You can do them together. Like if you do your Psalm passage and then you want to do your Proverbs passage at the same time, that's perfectly fine. Just don't put them in the same assignment. Submit them as 2 separate assignments. Okay. But it might even be a little easier if you haven't done either assignment yet to do them together. Do it first for your Psalms and then do it for your Proverbs, since it will be fresh. You know, the assignment requirements will be fresh. They're essentially the same. So you're more than welcome to do them in parallel. Do one and then the other. All right. But just don't combine them. Don't submit them as one assignment. Submit them as separate assignments. Okay. That may be easier for you at this point if you haven't done both of them. Just do them together. You know, do your Psalms passage one day, and then the next day do your Proverbs one. This assignment shouldn't take you more than a couple hours, I don't think. Maybe for Proverbs, it'll be a little longer because you're reading the whole chapter. So it'll be more verses. So maybe a little bit longer for that one. Okay. All right. I didn't have anything else I covered those assignments. So that was all I wanted to take care of today. Next week, Lord willing, we'll focus on the next assignment, which is parallelism. So we'll review that real quickly, and then we'll take a look at the assignment to do the parallelism for your passage, for your Psalms and your Proverbs passage. Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yes, sir.
and why the book of Habakkuk not considered as poetic literature?
As poetic literature?
Yes, it is not a prophecy. He's not listening from God to tell the people. He was talking to God, according to the study that I made.
Yeah. For Habakkuk, the prophetic genre, which we're going to cover in the next module, much of the prophetic genre is written using poetry. So if you look at Isaiah, you look at Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Obadiah, Joel, Hosea, much of it will have poetry, be written in the form of a poetic genre, figures of speech, imagery, which makes sense because the prophetic genre has a lot of emotion to it, right? It's very powerful emotionally. So it makes sense they would use poetic language often. Now, Jonah is unique. It's not a poem, but it's a narrative, but there is a poem inside the narrative, actually, in Jonah 2. So with Habakkuk, yes, it is a poetic, it is written in the form of poetry. In fact, the last chapter is a psalm. And chapters 1 and 2 are written in poetic fashion, but there's a couple things. One, it's also narrative because it's a dialogue, the first two chapters, right? It's Habakkuk and the Lord in the dialogue. That's more like a narrative. And then chapter 3 is a poem, but also the reason it's prophetic genre is because Habakkuk was a prophet. And we'll talk about this in the next module, but the class of prophets, they didn't just tell the future. That's not what made them a prophet. What made them a prophet was that they were speaking on God's behalf to the people, calling them to be faithful to the covenant. That's what a prophet did. Now, sometimes they were given future events as part of their message to the people. But they were a prophet not because they were given the future event. They were a prophet because of their job to call the people to repentance and faithfulness to the covenant. Okay? So Habakkuk was one of those. That was his role or ministry. But you're right, the book of Habakkuk is written in the form of poetry. And so we have to use poetic analysis in Habakkuk, but we also have to use narrative analysis in Habakkuk. So that's why I saved the prophetic genre till the last one, because it's the hardest. That's a long explanation, but does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Pastor Alan is raising his hand. Pastor Tim.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah.
Pastor Alan is raising his hand.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
What?
You had your hand raised?
I did not
Oh, that was accident.
did you hear the thundering around me on the background? Very heavy rain here.
Oh, wow. Did you have a question?
Pastor Alan, you have your icon, raised hand icon.
Okay. Sorry for that. Maybe I pressed it because I was rearranging my sound because of the rain.
No
I
problem.
couldn't hear properly, so excuse to that. Sorry.
No problem. Here's my icons.
Love you.
Any others? How about this one? Ah! Oh, this
Pastor-
one. Oh!
Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
Pastor Tim, it's like the book of James, who is an epistle, not to be considered as poetic literature.
Yeah. Yeah, James is in the form of an epistle, right? It's got the same introduction like an epistle, the author to the recipients, a form of greeting, and then it's laid out with like an epistle in the paragraphs. Now, within it, there is some poetic expressions and some proverbial expressions, right? Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. That was a proverbial expression, but the book is an epistle. Or Jonah. Jonah isn't really a narrative, but it's in the prophetic section. Jonah doesn't really tell anything about the future in the book. He just gives a call of warning to the people, but he was a prophet. So he's included in that. So we'll talk a lot about that when we get to the prophetic genre, that really you have to understand who the prophets are first and what their job was. The prophetic genre is not just about telling the future. Actually, too, if you read of the prophets, most of their books are not about the future. Actually, you know, a lot of them, almost all of them will have something about the future in the book, but not a lot of the books. The majority of the book is not a future telling thing. But there is some elements of that. And some books, there's a lot of future events being told, but like Zechariah, a lot of that book is about is future events. But if you look at Jeremiah, there's a lot of narrative in that book. that he talks about. So the prophets are very interesting and very challenging. But Noor makes an excellent observation in that when you're studying a lot of them, when you study them like Habakkuk, you do have to see that it is poetry being used. So you would need to use some of the analysis we're doing for poems when you study Habakkuk. All right, there's figurative language there, there's imagery there, there's some parallelism there, there's stanzas. Okay, so we need to recognize that when we interpret the book of Habakkuk. Okay. All right, really good question. Any others? Anything about the assignments? Okay. Well, that's all I have for you guys for today. Hopefully that covered enough, gave you an idea of what to do for the assignments. And we'll gather, Lord willing, next week and talk about the next assignment on parallelism. All right, review that a little bit as well. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I'm going to ask if Pastor Allen could go ahead and close us, or is it too noisy there, Allen? Can you close us in prayer?